The chime of the seatbelt sign was normal. The sudden gut-wrenching plunge was not. Plastic cracked. Oxygen masks deployed with a dull clatter. Screams erupted from the back of the cabin, but the real terror came from the intercom. Not a voice, just ragged, desperate breathing. The cockpit was dying. Amelia Cassidy hated flying commercial. It wasn't the lack of legroom in 14E, or the businessman in the window seat loudly chewing ice while watching an action movie on his tablet. It was the absolute, utter lack of control. For a decade, Amelia's office had been the cockpit of an FA-18 Super Hornet. She was used to feeling the mechanics of flight vibrating directly through her spine, the control stick an extension of her own nervous system. She knew what every whine of the hydraulics meant. She knew the exact mathematical threshold between a stable glide and a catastrophic stall. She knew the smell of hot jet fuel and the crushing weight of 9 Gs pinning her to an ejection seat. Down here, in the passenger cabin of a Boeing 737, somewhere over the desolate crags of the Nevada desert, she was just freight, cargo with a pulse. She rested her forehead against the cool, cheap plastic of the tray table in front of her and closed her eyes. She was tired. It was a bone-deep, cynical exhaustion that came from trading a relentless combat deployment for a quiet civilian life that felt entirely too loud. No one shot at you at the grocery store, but the fluorescent lights gave her a migraine, and the endless, vapid chatter about interest rates and celebrity divorces made her want to crawl out of her own skin. She was 32, honorably discharged, carrying a web of burn scars up her left forearm from a carrier deck fire, and thoroughly lost. The plane shuddered. Amelia didn't open her eyes. Minor turbulence. She felt the heavy, sluggish yaw of the aircraft. The autopilot was making micro-adjustments. A commercial airliner was a flying bus, stable, predictable, built to correct its own mistakes. Then came the smell. It was faint at first, creeping silently through the overhead air conditioning vents. A foul, acrid odor, like dirty gym socks left in a hot car, underscored by the sharp metallic tang of burning synthetic oil. Amelia's eyes snapped open. The businessman next to her pulled one of his AirPods out and sniffed the air, his nose wrinkling. Jesus, did someone blow up the lavatory? It wasn't the lavatory. Amelia knew that smell. It was a phantom scent that haunted the aviation maintenance reports she used to study. Bleed air contamination. A seal in one of the massive Pratt & Whitney engines had failed, pumping toxic heated engine oil fumes directly into the aircraft's environmental control system. It was a rare, worst-case scenario. Organophosphates, neurotoxins, the kind of airborne poison that didn't just make you cough. It shut down your central nervous system in minutes. Up front, the flight attendants were still smiling, walking the aisle, handing out half cans of ginger ale and miniature pretzels. They didn't know. The air in the main cabin cycled slower than the air up front. Amelia unbuckled her seatbelt. The metallic click was swallowed by the drone of the engines. Before she could stand, the aircraft violently lurched. It wasn't a bump. It was a sheer, terrifying drop. The floor simply fell away, gravity inverted. The businessman slammed upward against his lap belt, his plastic cup of ice water hitting the ceiling and exploding into a shower of cold droplets. Screams tore through the cabin, a chaotic chorus of sudden terror. A beverage cart in the aisle tipped backward, crashing to the carpet in a tangle of crushed cans, shattered ice, and spilled coffee. Amelia gripped the armrests. Her breathing slowed. Her heart rate, paradoxically, dropped. the civilian panic fading out, replaced instantly by the cold, metallic focus she'd been trained to maintain while dodging surface-to-air missiles over Damascus. The noise of the screaming passengers became background static. The nose of the 737 pitched up sharply, too sharply. The sudden G-forces pressed Amelia deep into the cheap foam cushion of her seat. The engines roared, struggling against the sudden, unnatural angle of attack. They were climbing too fast, bleeding off airspeed. Stall. The word flashed in her mind a fraction of a second before the aircraft shuddered violently. It was the unmistakable, terrifying buffeting of a wing losing its aerodynamic lift. The plane hung suspended in the air for a microscopic moment of weightlessness. Then the nose slammed down. The dive was sickening. The overhead compartments rattled violently. Yellow oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling panels like dead snakes, swaying on their plastic tethers. The cabin went completely dark for a second before the emergency lighting flickered on, casting a pale, clinical glow over the chaos. People were sobbing, praying, grabbing frantically at the masks, trying to strap them to their faces. Amelia ignored the mask dangling in front of her. The air in the back of the cabin was still breathable. She stared down the aisle toward the forward galley. A flight attendant, a young woman with a torn stocking and terrified eyes, was clinging to a bulkhead handle, her knuckles white. She was staring fixedly at the reinforced cockpit door. The intercom clicked. It hissed with static over the roar of the diving plane. "Help!" It was barely a whisper, a raspy, choking, desperate sound. "Please, can't breathe, can't..." The intercom cut out with a sharp pop. Amelia was already moving. She pushed past the businessman, ignoring his panicked shout, and stepped into the aisle. The floor was angled downward at a terrifying 20 degrees. They were in a steep dive. Walking required hauling herself forward by the seatbacks, hand over hand, fighting the gravity that wanted to throw her into the cockpit door. "Miss, you need to sit down! Put on your mask!" the young flight attendant yelled, her voice cracking. She didn't let go of the bulkhead. Amelia ignored her. She reached the first-class cabin. It was empty save for 3 people, all curled into the crash position, weeping into their knees. The reinforced cockpit door was secure, but the keypad panel next to it was flashing a frantic red. "Open it," Amelia said, reaching the forward galley. A senior flight attendant, a woman in her 50s with an immaculate bun that was now slightly askew, was braced against the beverage station. She looked at Amelia like she was an apparition. "Are you out of your mind? Sit down." "The pilots are incapacitated," Amelia said. Her voice was flat, devoid of panic. It cut through the screaming in the cabin like a scalpel. "Toxic fume event. They've passed out. If you don't open this door right now, we are going to hit the side of a mountain in less than 4 minutes." The senior attendant stared. Her training was actively fighting her survival instincts. Post 9/11 protocol dictated that you never, under any circumstances, opened the flight deck door during a crisis. Physics, however, dictated that they were falling out of the sky at 400 miles an hour. The plane banked violently to the left. The overhead bins above them popped open, raining heavy carry-on luggage down onto the empty first-class seats with a series of heavy thuds. "Code," Amelia demanded, stepping into the woman's personal space. "Now." The woman swallowed hard, reached out with a trembling hand, and punched a 4-digit emergency override sequence into the pad. A 30-second timer began to count down. Override it, Amelia snapped. I can't. If they don't deny entry, it opens in 30 seconds. They waited. The longest 30 seconds of Amelia's life. The airframe was vibrating now, a deep structural hum that told Amelia they were nearing the aircraft's maximum operating speed. If they went much faster, the wings would simply rip off. The heavy lock clicked. Amelia shoved the door open. The noise hit her first. The deafening roar of the wind rushing over the nose of the jet, screaming against the windshield. Then, the alarms. Beep, 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 overspeed, terrain, pull up. The automated voice was calm, female, and utterly chilling. The flight deck was a graveyard. A thick, blue-gray haze hung in the cramped space. The smell was overpowering here, burning rubber and caustic chemicals. It coated the back of Amelia's throat, tasting like old pennies. The first officer, a young man in his late 20s, was slumped sideways over the center console, his oxygen mask dangling uselessly by his knee. He had tried to put it on, but the neurotoxins had hit him too fast, shutting down his motor functions before he could secure the straps. The captain was still strapped firmly into the left seat. His head was thrown back, eyes rolled up, chest barely moving. His right hand was locked in a localized seizure, maintaining a death grip on the yoke, pushing it forward and slightly left. He was flying them directly into the ground. "Help me move him," Amelia barked over her shoulder. The senior flight attendant hovered in the doorway, paralyzed by the sight. I can't do it," Amelia roared. The raw military command voice shattered the woman's hesitation. Together, they reached over the center console and unclipped the captain's 5-point harness. He was dead weight, easily 200 pounds of limp muscle. Amelia grabbed him under the arms, bracing her boots against the heavy throttle quadrant, and hauled him backward. The flight attendant pulled his legs. They dumped him unceremoniously onto the narrow floor grating just outside the cockpit door. Amelia didn't stop to check his pulse. Triage. The airplane was the only patient that mattered right now. She slid into the left seat. The leather was still warm. "What are you doing?" The flight attendant screamed over the blaring klaxons. "You're a passenger!" Amelia grabbed the heavy aviation headset off the dashboard and jammed it over her ears, physically shutting out the woman's voice. She reached over and slammed the flight deck door shut, locking it. She was alone. She keyed the intercom switch, broadcasting to the cabin. "I can fly this jet. Brace for impact." She didn't wait to hear the reaction. Her eyes swept the glass cockpit, decoding the glowing screens in a fraction of a second. Primary flight display, navigation display, engine indicating and crew alerting system. Airspeed, 380 knots and climbing. They were deep in the red zone. The airframe was rattling, groaning under aerodynamic loads it was never designed to take. Altitude, 11,000 feet. Descending at 5,000 feet per minute. Attitude, 25 degrees nose down, 30 degrees left bank. Terrain, pull up. Amelia grabbed the yoke. Her hands felt small against the thick, molded plastic. She gripped the thrust levers with her right hand and pulled them all the way back to idle, killing the engine thrust to stop their acceleration. Then she pulled back on the yoke. Nothing happened. The aircraft was too heavy. The aerodynamic forces pressing on the elevators too extreme at this speed. An F-18 would have snapped its nose up instantly, responsive as a sports car. The 737 felt like it was encased in solid concrete. She gritted her teeth, planting her boots firmly on the rudder pedals for leverage, and pulled harder. Her biceps strained, the burn scars on her forearms turning stark white under the immense tension. "Come on, you heavy bitch," she muttered through gritted teeth. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the artificial horizon on the digital screen began to creep upward. The violent shuddering of the airframe started to smooth out as the speed bled off. 9,000 feet. Amelia rolled the yoke to the right, fighting the sluggish ailerons to level the wings. 8,000 feet. The G-forces hit her hard as the plane finally bit into the air and pulled out of the steep dive, pushing her down into the seat with crushing weight. Her vision grayed at the edges. She tensed her legs and core, forcing blood back up to her brain, an anti-G straining maneuver she'd executed 1,000 times in dogfights. The nose finally came up. The altimeter stopped unwinding at exactly 6,800 feet. Below the broken cloud deck, the jagged snow-capped peaks of the Sierra Nevadas looked close enough to scrape the belly of the fuselage. Amelia exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She leveled the aircraft, aggressively spinning the trim wheel to find the delicate aerodynamic balance required to keep the heavy jet flying straight without the autopilot. A wet, rattling groan came from the right seat. Amelia glanced over. The first officer was twitching. The heavy rush of fresh air from the ventilation system, clearing out the localized fume pocket after the seal had completely blown out, was slowly bringing him around. He blinked, bleary-eyed, looking at the empty captain's seat. Then he slowly turned his head to the left. He stared at Amelia. She was wearing a faded flannel shirt, beat-up jeans, and dog tags resting against her collarbone. Her hands were steady, locked onto his captain's yoke. "Who?" he croaked, coughing violently, a string of saliva hanging from his lip. "Who are you?" Amelia didn't look at him. Her eyes were locked on the navigation display, aggressively scanning for the nearest runway. "I'm your new captain," she said, her voice entirely deadpan. "Now shut up, put your mask on, and walk me through the FMC. We have an airplane to land." The first officer, whose name tag read David, fumbled a yellow plastic oxygen mask over his nose and mouth. He sucked in greedy, ragged breaths, his chest heaving under his wrinkled white uniform shirt. The toxic haze in the cockpit was already dissipating, sucked out by the outflow valves, but the damage to his nervous system lingered. His hands shook violently. "FMC," Amelia repeated. She kept her eyes glued to the artificial horizon. "I need an airport, now." David leaned forward, his trembling fingers hovering over the flight management computer keypad on the center console. He punched a button, clearing a string of digital error messages. "Reno," he rasped through the mask. "Reno Tahoe International. It's at our 2 o'clock, 40 miles. Give me a heading and dial in the localizer frequency." Amelia didn't look to see if he was doing it. She was busy fighting the airplane. A Boeing 737 was not designed to be manhandled. It was a massive computerized system of compromises, built for fuel efficiency and passenger comfort. Right now, it felt like balancing a school bus on a tightrope. The air off the Sierras was notoriously choppy. Brutal updrafts, invisible to the naked eye, slammed into the underside of the wings, trying to flip them over. Amelia's right leg was locked out, pressing hard against the rudder pedal to keep the nose straight. Then the master caution alarm shrieked. It was a loud, obnoxious wail that rattled Amelia's teeth. A red light illuminated on the center panel, blindingly bright in the dim cockpit. ENG-2 fire. God, no, David choked out, staring at the panel. The bleed air. The seal failed and now the compressor is tearing itself apart. We're on fire. Amelia didn't hesitate. Fighter pilots didn't have the luxury of committee meetings when things caught fire. You isolated the problem, or you ejected. There was no ejection seat here. Confirm engine 2, Amelia barked. Confirmed, David said, his voice rising in panic. We need to run the checklist. Amelia reached up to the overhead panel, bypassing standard commercial procedure, her hand moving purely on military instinct. She grabbed the red fire switch for the right engine, pulled it out, and twisted it hard to the left. A dull thump vibrated through the floorboards as the halon bottles discharged into the engine nacelle, suffocating the flames. Simultaneously, she grabbed the right thrust lever and yanked it to cutoff. The heavy roar of the aircraft instantly changed pitch. The right side went dead, quiet. Immediately, the 737 violently slewed to the right, dragged by the dead weight of the ruined engine and pushed by the uneven thrust of the remaining left engine. Amelia grunted, slamming her left boot entirely to the floor on the rudder pedal to counter the yaw. Her calf cramped instantly. It took 60 pounds of continuous punishing pressure just to keep the jet flying in a straight line. Oakland Center, David was saying into his headset microphone, his voice frantic. Mayday, 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 Flight 142, heavy. We have an engine fire, engine shut down, captain incapacitated, declaring an emergency. A crackle of static. Then a calm, deeply confused voice from the ground. Flight 142, Oakland. Say again your status. Who is flying the aircraft? Amelia didn't wait for David to answer. She thumbed the transmit switch on her yoke. Oakland Center, this is a passenger at the controls of 142, she said. Her voice was flat, bored, almost annoyed. It was the exact tone she used to use when coordinating airstrikes over hostile territory. I have one engine dead, one captain unconscious on the floor, and roughly 150 people in the back. Give me a vector to Reno runway 16 right. Clear the airspace. Silence on the radio. 5 full seconds of dead air. The controller was likely staring at his radar scope, trying to process the absolute absurdity of the transmission. Flight 142, Oakland, copy. Turn left heading 040. Descend and maintain 6,000. Are you a pilot? FE-18s, Amelia replied. First time flying a bus. Talk to my first officer for the commercial paperwork. I'm busy. She released the transmit button. Her arms were burning. The yoke felt like it was embedded in wet cement. She glanced at the fuel gauges. They had enough gas to fly to Chicago, which was actually a liability. The plane was incredibly heavy. Landing a fully loaded single-engine airliner on a high-altitude runway was a mathematical nightmare. David, Amelia said, I need approach speeds. I don't know the stall margins on this airframe. If I get too slow, we fall out of the sky. If I get too fast, we blow the tires off when we hit the runway. David swallowed, tapping frantically at the FMC. He was pale, sweating profusely, fighting off the lingering effects of the neurotoxin. VREF, reference speed is 142 knots. With one engine, we have to use flaps 15. Flaps 15. Good. Amelia scanned the instruments. Airspeed 210 knots. Altitude 7,500 feet. The jagged peaks of the mountains were receding, giving way to the high desert basin of Nevada. Far in the distance, nestled against the brown foothills, a geometric grid of gray concrete and flashing strobe lights appeared. Reno. "I see the runway," Amelia said. She looked back at the cockpit door. Beyond it, 150 people were sitting in absolute terror. They didn't have parachutes. They didn't have G-suits. They had tray tables in their upright and locked positions. Freight. Amelia tightened her grip on the yoke. The cynical exhaustion that had plagued her for months was gone, burned away by the raw, metallic taste of adrenaline. She wasn't going to let them die. The runway grew from a postage stamp into a massive slab of cracked asphalt. The wind shear coming off the Sierras was vicious. The 737 shuddered and dropped, caught in a downdraft. Amelia pushed the left throttle forward. The single engine spooled up with a delayed, agonizing whine, asymmetric thrust immediately trying to drag the nose to the right again. Her left leg was completely numb. She was maintaining the rudder pressure, purely through sheer force of will, her knee trembling violently under the strain. 2,000 feet, David called out. His voice was stronger now, settling back into the rigid rhythms of his training. The panic was fading, replaced by the clinical necessity of the checklist. Localizer captured. Glide slope alive. "Drop the gear," Amelia ordered. David reached up and pulled the heavy wheel-shaped lever downward. The floor vibrated with 3 heavy mechanical thuds as the massive landing gear dropped into the slipstream and locked into place. The aerodynamic drag hit the aircraft like a physical wall. The nose wanted to drop. Amelia hauled back on the yoke, muscles in her shoulders bunching tight. "Flaps to 15, she grunted. David deployed the flaps. The wing geometry changed, creating more lift, but heavily increasing the drag. The airspeed tape on the digital display began to tick downward. 170 knots, 160 knots. "Keep your hand on that right throttle," Amelia said, not looking at him. "If this single engine fails now, we become a brick. Be ready to dump the fuel. 150 knots. 1,000 feet, the automated ground proximity warning system announced. The computerized voice was completely devoid of the tension soaking the cockpit. Amelia stared at the threshold of the runway. The massive white piano keys painted on the asphalt were rushing up to meet them. In a fighter jet, you didn't land. You arrived. You aimed for the deck of the carrier and let the structural integrity of the landing gear take the punishment. You flew the plane directly into the ground and caught a wire. A commercial jet couldn't take that. If she drove this 150,000-pound machine into the concrete at this angle, the landing gear would shear clean off, and the plane would disintegrate into a sliding fireball of aviation fuel and shattered aluminum. She had to finesse it. She had to flare, pulling the nose up at the very last second to cushion the impact. 500 feet. The crosswind battered the fuselage. The left wing dipped. Amelia slammed the yoke to the right, crossing her controls, kicking the rudder against the wind to keep the nose pointed down the center line. 100 feet. 50. 40. 30. Retard! Retard! The computer demanded she pull the throttle back. Amelia ripped the left throttle to idle. 20. 10. She hauled back on the yoke. She pulled with everything she had, fighting the heavy, sluggish aerodynamics. The nose rose. The aircraft hung in the air for one breathless, agonizing second, defying gravity. Then, the main gear slammed into the concrete. The impact was bone-jarring. The overhead panels rattled furiously. An oxygen mask shook loose and fell onto the center console. "Speed brakes!" Amelia shouted. David deployed the spoilers. Massive panels on the wings shot upward, instantly killing the remaining lift. Amelia stomped on the toe brakes, pressing them to the floor. The anti-skid system kicked in, vibrating through the pedals in heavy, violent stutters. "Reverse thrust!" David pulled the reverser lever on the live engine. The engine roared in protest, throwing a massive wall of exhaust forward, fighting the plane's forward momentum. The asymmetrical braking violently jerked the plane toward the left edge of the runway. Amelia fought it, wrestling the steering tiller, her knuckles white. The end of the runway was approaching fast. The yellow blast pads, the dirt perimeter, the speedometer ticked down. 80 knots, 60, 40. With a heavy, groaning squeal of superheated carbon brakes, the Boeing 737 shuddered to a complete, violent stop. They were 50 feet from the end of the pavement. Absolute silence fell over the cockpit, broken only by the whine of the dying gyros and the heavy, ragged breathing of the two people up front. Outside the windshield, an armada of flashing red and yellow lights was already rushing across the tarmac toward them. Fire trucks, ambulances. Amelia slowly took her hands off the yoke. Her fingers were cramped into claws. She flexed them, staring at the scarred tissue on her forearm. It throbbed. She reached up, pulled the heavy headset off, and dropped it onto the dashboard. David stared at her. He was weeping, silent tears cutting tracks through the soot and sweat on his face. He unbuckled his harness, his hands shaking so badly he could barely manage the clasp. "You," David whispered, "you saved us." Amelia didn't answer. She unclipped her own harness, stood up in the cramped space, and stepped over the unconscious captain, still lying on the floor grating. She unlocked the heavy cockpit door and pulled it open. The cabin was a disaster zone. Luggage was strewn everywhere. Oxygen masks hung like plastic vines. 150 pairs of eyes stared at her. No one spoke. No one screamed. The silence was heavier than the G-forces. The senior flight attendant was clutching a bulkhead, staring at Amelia with her mouth slightly open. Amelia didn't smile. She didn't offer a comforting word. She simply walked down the aisle, her boots crunching over spilled ice and crushed plastic cups, found her seat in 14E, and sat down. She folded her arms across her chest, leaned her head against the cool plastic of the window, and closed her eyes. She just wanted to sleep. Sometimes the line between absolute disaster and survival rests in the exhausted hands of a stranger who simply refuses to quit. Amelia Cassidy traded the skies of combat for a quiet civilian life, only to find that the fight never truly leaves you. It just waits for you in seat 14E. If this story of high-altitude tension kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share with your friends, and subscribe for more incredible survival stories.